We're talking today about Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and the Hasidic Jewish movement, which takes off beginning in the 1700s and really accelerates in the late 17 to early 1800s. And on one level, you might think this is a very odd topic to use as the beginning of the modern Jewish history block that we'll be studying. And there's a couple of reasons why I decided that modern history could legitimately be counted as beginning with this, with the caveat that, of course, our imposition of eras is artificial looking backwards. You know, it's not like it turned to 1700 and people said, oh, it's Enlightenment time, and they decided to just start changing it. You know, this is our retrospective looking back and saying, well, modernity starts at this point. You know, nobody turned the calendar page and said, oh, it's modern era now. So take it with a grain of salt, understand it's sort of a spectrum and it's sort of a gradual process of what we might define as modern in Jewish history. And we also have to remember that modernity strikes differently in different parts of the world. That is, Jews living in the United States might have hit the postmodern era at a different point than Jews living in the Ottoman Empire or living in Iran under the Ayatollahs. And there are still tens of thousands of Jews there. So, their particular moment of their own cultural, historical, intellectual, religious development may be different based on different geography. And certainly this will be the case, as we'll see, for Jews living in Western Europe and Jews living in Eastern Europe, because the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, will have an impact in Western Europe somewhat before it makes its way into Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, I do think that talking about the Hasidic movement in particular is a useful way to begin to conceptualize modern Jewish history for three basic reasons. The first reason is one of the features of modern Jewish life is that we don't have a universal halachic Jewish legal consensus, where if you were living in the Jewish world in 1500 and you went from Baghdad to Cairo to Venice to Warsaw, you would generally have similar standards for kosher practice, for what the prayer book would include. I mean, your accent will be different, the melodies might be different, but the content and the legal requirements for observing Shabbat, for what prayers needed to be said when, for what the sources of rabbinic authority were, basically the Talmud and the codes of Jewish law that were promulgated very broadly. There was a general halachic consensus of what Jewish life meant and what it meant to be Jewish. And the Hasidic movement really marks the first significant break, and to some extent the Jewish mysticism that led into the Hasidic movement that we'll talk about today, led to a break with this halachic consensus. And so that since that's a sign of modern Jewish life, because obviously today there's no halachic consensus on anything, even within the ultra-Orthodox world, there's major debates over certain issues, certainly within the non-Orthodox Jewish world, which is the vast majority of Jews, both in Israel and in the US, again, 70% or higher in both places, we understand that we're on the other side of that split. The other parallel or sort of aspect to that break with halachic consensus, you remember when we talked previously about the Ashkenazi Jewish experience, the idea of the Kehillah as a Jewish self-governing body, and the fact that the Kehillah could appoint a local rabbi who would have jurisdiction over what happens in the town. And there was a synagogue of the town that everyone went to. There was, again, an establishment, and there might even be a hierarchy if you had the yeshiva that rabbi was trained in, and then the Council of the Four Lands making international decisions almost, covering all the territories under the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. Well, with the rise of Hasidism, where you have a charismatic Rebbe that you feel attached to, even if you don't happen to live in the town where he is in charge, nevertheless, you're following his rulings and not your local rabbi's rulings. Now that's, again, a breakdown of that traditional authority. And this is where we live today. In Germany, in France, in England, there is a chief rabbinate that appoints official rabbis, and very few people listen to them. The same is true in Israel. There's a chief rabbinate, and for some people, the chief rabbinate is an outside religious authority telling them what to do, and they hate it. And for other people, the chief rabbinate is a sellout and not religious enough for them and their ultra-Orthodoxy, and they don't listen to him either. So the chief rabbinate has a limited cachet, even in Israel, even if they have the force of law behind them. And this break with the authority says so, and it's a top-down structure, and you have to listen to what the rabbi of the town says, That's this side of modernity, and that comes out of the Hasidic moment. A second aspect of Hasidism and Jewish mysticism that I think is relevant to the modern period of Jewish history is that the Hasidic world begins to emphasize the importance of the individual, in particular, the individual's emotion and state of mind when participating in Jewish life, particularly in the prayer service, where it's not just a function of rote recitation and rote study and do what you're told, but rather it becomes a process of emotional, what's called kavanah, intention. And your emotional process might be even more important than the rote recitation itself. There's a famous story from out of Hasidic circles where a man is not educated. He's a working class person who didn't have the opportunity to go to school long enough. He knows almost nothing of reading in the prayer book. All he really knows is the Aleph Bet, the alphabet. And so when it's time for the prayer service, he recites the Aleph Bet, but he does it with such devotion and such love and such intensity that is deemed as acceptable as if it had been recited perfectly, word for word, letter for letter, vowel for vowel. Now, for the traditional rabbinic authorities, what are you talking about, intention? God said, say these words, so you have to say these words. But from the Hasidic world, and remember the word Hasidic, or Hasid for the person, comes from the same root as the Hebrew word chesed, which means like love and caring love. It's an emotional experience. But most importantly, by making the individual the measuring point of what is an authentic Jewish experience, that also plays into the modern world where people are choosing their synagogue by how it makes them feel. They're choosing the movement of Judaism to which they're attached by emotional attachment. And the measurement of meaningful Jewish connection is not generally how strictly you follow the rules. Again, depends on community, but it's also, does it strike you in the kishkas, you'd say in Yiddish, in the guts? Is it really something that moves you as a person? That again is a modern measurement. And the last point, and this may feel a little paradoxical to you, that marks Hasidic Judaism as a harbinger of modern Jewish history, the rejection of modernity is also modern. That is, before the dawning of the Hasidic movement and the reaction against them called the Mitnagdim, the opponents, and then the mutual enemy of both the Mitnagdim and the Hasidim called the Maskilim, the enlighteners, before that time you had a kind of traditionalist style of Jewish practice where the community generally did the traditional practice, but if one person bent the rules a bit to have a warm coffee on Saturday afternoon, they weren't fanatics about it. What happens in the Hasidic world is you get this fanaticism of rejection of the modern world. So much so that one of the codifiers of this practice actually comes out with a saying that says, what is new is forbidden by the Torah. Now, what's funny is that some days people who are defending that perspective are tweeting it out. Well, I thought, what was new was forbidden. Well, you have to decide where is it new and where is it not new. But this concept of we have to freeze things and you're not allowed to change anything because any change could be the camel's nose in the tent that makes it, in the end, unsustainable. And so that's why the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world still wears the black hats, the black hats, the fur hats in some of the sects, the black clothing that was typical of Polish nobility in the 1700s. They were simply imitating the surrounding culture, but they stopped changing. It's like the Amish, who picked a point in time and said, we're not doing anything from this point forward. And so that's why they don't have zippers. They have hooks and eyes. But they will take trains, because trains existed at the cutoff date for them. So the ultra-Orthodox are the same way. In some ways, they've said certain things will not change from this point forward, including dress and including women's mores and so on. However, it can change, it can get stricter. This is one of the ironies, is that the ultra-Orthodox world actually has changed, even over the last 100 years, but generally in a more strict direction. So much so, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago detailing the revisionist history that's been done. It's like worthy of the Soviet Union, where they've gone back and photoshopped pictures of the founding generation of certain rabbis and their sects and lengthened the women's sleeves, or even Photoshop them out entirely to make them match today's standards when they were willing to do things a little bit more leniently in the old country 80 or 100 years ago. So the rejection of modernity is also modern. You might use a cell phone and you might use a computer for business, but if you're saying that modern culture is treif, and I need to make even higher and higher and stricter walls around me, that's modern. The word orthodox is coined in the 19th century. It didn't need to be coined before, just like the Catholic Church wasn't called the Catholic Church until the Protestant Reformation. It was just the church because they didn't care about the Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox, and they were the church in Western Europe. That was it. So the Orthodox world, in fact, is a reaction against, and it's reaffirming their truth. Ortho as in correct, dox as in doctrine, and in other words, everybody else is wrong. But you don't have an orthodoxy until you have a modernity that leads to people leaving, and you have to push back. So ironically, the rejection of modernity is also part of modernity. So we're going to begin with Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah as the harbinger of modernity. But to do that, we have to go back in time a little bit into the late Middle Ages, because that's really where the roots of this version of Jewish mystical thought begins. Now, when you say mysticism, it helps to define it a bit, but part of the challenge is that mysticism is describing the ineffable experience of emotional, supernatural, mind-opening, whatever. And so it's hard to put your finger exactly on what it is. There is a fantastic book of scholarship on this that was written in the 1940s. It's still a standard textbook today. And if you know anything about how academia works, having something written in the 40s that's still a standard textbook for the subject is really impressive. It's called Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by a man named Gershom Scholem. So we had the same last name, just with an accent shift. And he was a German scholar who wound up moving to Israel shortly before World War II, and became the world expert on Jewish mysticism. There's a famous anecdote that he once came to speak at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and he was introduced by a very famous Talmudist and Jewish legal scholar who said, well, we all know that Jewish mysticism is narishkeit, is foolishness, but the study of narishkeit, that is great scholarship. Now, Scholem himself had a very different perspective on what Jewish mysticism was, because his take was this was a legitimate response to history. It was an intellectual trend. It was, in fact, sometimes more dominant than the strictly follow the Talmud rationalist trend in Jewish life. You know, I mentioned it when we talked about Maimonides, that Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, that philosophical treatise written in academic Judeo-Arabic, was actually burned by some rabbis who thought it was heretical. And these rabbis were part of that mystical trend because he was going in the opposite direction. He was abstracting God into undefinable words, and they were making God even more intimate in terms of personal, mystical, magical, mind-altering experience. So what Scholem describes as the historical context for mysticism is important for us to think about. For example, what might cause a mystical moment in a religious tradition? Well, some examples that Scholem brings are, what if there's a major social dislocation? Everything you thought to be normal and stable gets uprooted, and you yourself are on the move and have to find new grounds. And so the old rituals of, I'll say these words and God will protect me, I'll recite these prayers and everything will be fine, that doesn't seem to be working anymore. And so maybe, you know, as Rin comments, you start to lose your hope in the rational, predictable world, and you have to turn to something else that's more direct contact to God, not mediated by the prayers and the Torah readings, but I want to talk to God directly and have that direct experience. So that might be a spur for mystical developments. Sometimes the legalism gets more legalistic and more legalistic and more legalistic to the point that you're missing the point here. You know, for some people, they can observe the small details of cleaning the house for Passover and hear God's word in fulfilling the little tiny details. But for other people, they can't hear God through the details. You know, it's too legalistic, it's too minutia, and they want something else. They want a shortcut. They want an immediate, not mediated experience through the Torah, through the Talmud, through the halakha, through the law. They want something direct. And finally, the surrounding context can make a difference. In particular, that region in Provence I mentioned that had people who rejected Maimonidean rationalism was a hotbed of mystical thought in both Spain and in what is today France, in both Christian and Islamic circles. And so it's not a surprise that Jewish intellectuals are exposed to similar thoughts in the intellectual circles of the day and themselves become inclined to explore mystical context. It's not an accident that the modern day Jewish renewal movement, which is sometimes thought of as a Jewish New Age approach, comes about in the counterculture period of the 60s and 70s, when people are exploring Buddhism and Hinduism and Hare Krishna and similar kinds of mystical moments, right? There's a cross-fertilization of that phenomenon. So what I want to do to start to explain a little bit about this mysticism, again, it's putting into words what they don't want you to put into words. Let me say one thing before I share an image with you. I don't personally believe that this mysticism stuff is factually true, but it's important to know what people think and what they believe. So as I'm describing this, I don't want you to get caught up in it and thinking that I'm actually coming up with a new atomic theory based on the Kabbalistic cosmology of the universe. Rather, this is understanding the phenomenon to be able to understand its cultural influence in later times and places. So here's an example of the basic premise of the Kabbalah, especially as formulated in a book called the Zohar. Zohar means splendor, wonder, brilliant light. And the Zohar is framed as sort of a walking and talking commentary. It imagines that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, son of Yochai, who lives around the year 200, around year 100 at the beginning of the 2nd century of the Common Era, that early Mishnah period. He's wandering around the land of Israel and he's sharing these special mystical interpretations of rabbinic sources, specifically of the Torah and his interpretation. So you might have the surface meaning of the Torah, that's the pshat, the simple version. And then you might have an allegorical meaning that a philosopher might give you, like Maimonides. And then this is the secret, the mystical meaning that's hidden inside the text. So I'll give you one example of one of those secret interpretations. The first few words of the Hebrew Bible are Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created, or in the beginning of God's creation, there's some debate over what the grammatical form is. But what the Kabbalists do is they actually look at the space in between the letters, because they think that the ultimate truth of the universe is a kind of mystical no thing that can't really be defined by human words or vocabulary or experience. It's what's above this chart here that emanates down into the world. They call it the Ein Sof, the beyond end, or the endless, the infinite. And so what they read out of those first few words of the Bible is that blank space is the unspeakable that emanates what we consider God. Bereshit bara Elohim. So in the beginning, created the Ein Sof, the infinite, the emanation that we consider God into the world. So it's like an extra layer, not just the Bible as the ultimate truth, but the secret truth behind the Bible is the ultimate truth, and it's unknowable and indescribable in human words, but we're going to write a long book about it. That's, again, the trick of mysticism. So what you see here is the different kind of emanations, what are called the Sefirot, or the sort of spheres. That's not a translation of the Hebrew, but they're different like aspects of God as God is projected into the world in different ways. So you have Keter at the top, which is considered the crown. This is, again, that mystical ayin, first contact in the world. You see that the mystical nothingness. You also have two sources of power. You've got understanding on one side and wisdom on the other. So this is the intellectual side of things. So you have the sort of rays of light coming down. You've got the head here. You've got then the sources of acting in the world. God sometimes acts under the aspect of deen or judgment. That's rigor and strength. But sometimes God is forgiving. And you get the aspect of love, forgiveness, chesed. So again, those are two sides of the coin. Is God a judging God that's going to punish you for your sins? Or is it a loving, forgiving God who will offer grace and forgive you for your sin? Now, it's a stereotype of Christianity that the Old Testament God is the judging God and the New Testament God is the forgiving God. The reality is that the God of the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic literature has both judgment and forgiveness. That's two parts of the same coin. Then you have a source of beauty, which is called Tiferet here in the middle. It's like wonder, splendor. This could be considered the sun, the heaven, and so on. Again, you'll notice there's different colors associated with these: red, white, green. Going further down, you've got the aspects of splendor and eternity, sometimes associated with arms and legs. You've got the Yesod, the foundation, which is sort of the germinative seed of the universe that helps create things, which is, I'm not joking, identified with the phallus and the male propagation. And then at the bottom, sort of by the feet, you have this direct presence in the world, which is presented as the Shekhinah. Shekhinah is from the same root as neighborhood or neighbor or residence. This is the divine presence in the world as we experience it. This is communion of Israel. This is the earth and moon, the apple orchard. It has all the colors of the rainbow. You'll also notice, if you know Hebrew grammar, it's feminine. And so it's interesting that there is a feminine aspect to the Godhead in this medieval period that's included as one of those 10 Sefirot. Now, it's the lowest of those. It's the most subordinate to the higher ones, certainly. But there is still this interesting detail of having this feminine aspect of the Godhead as part of this vision. So here's an example of these Sefirot, both as an imagined cosmology of the universe here. So here you have people relating to the Shekhinah near the bottom of the of that structure, and then going up to the sun, which is Tiferet, and then ultimately up to that mystical Yud-He, Vav-He, unknowable, everything that gradually emanates into the world in these different ways. And then you also see it sort of mapped out on the human form. Again, you've got that Yesod phallus, seed of the world source with the Shekhinah at the bottom, which is where the rubber hits the road, right? It's where our feet hit the ground, and that's the impact in the world. So this is the general framework conception of the Zohar as it's presenting this, and it sees this as sort of constitutive of the universe. This defines the atomic level to the cosmological level, right? Now, where did the Zohar come from? It wasn't actually written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, even though you'll still get people who make a pilgrimage to his grave every year from the Hasidic world, seeing him as the author of the Zohar. But just because it says this is the Torah Moses placed before the children of Israel, that don't make it true either. Okay, so where did the Zohar really come from? Well, around the year 1280, a man named Moses de Leon, who's living in Leon, Spain, says he received a special revelation that he managed to write down, and here it is. It's the Zohar, channeled magically and mystically from Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay, well, today we would interpret that as pious forgery, right? He wants people to read his stuff, but nobody's going to read Moshe's. So instead, they're going to read Shimon Bar Yochai's commentaries instead. Now, there are parts of the Zohar that clearly come from earlier sources. He didn't make it all up from scratch, but the final form that it comes in most likely was assembled by de Leon and largely, written and edited by him into one collection. But the Zohar takes off. It becomes a big, big success, in some ways more so than Maimonides in certain parts of the Jewish world. And the next major stage in this Jewish mystical journey is innovated by an Ashkenazi rabbi who's living in Sfat in the land of Israel. His name is the Ashkenazi Rabbi Yitzchak, or the Ari, but his name is Isaac Luria. That's his last name. And he creates this new model of Kabbalah called Lurianic Kabbalah, where he takes the premise of the divine power emanating into the world and creates a whole cosmology. And this is being done in the 1500s and the 1600s. So remember, this is after the expulsions from Western Europe, including the expulsion from Spain, a series of pogroms in response to the Black Death, the Crusades, all kinds of other major dislocations. So hear that history as I describe the basic creation story of the Lurianic Kabbalah. In the beginning, there was God who was everything. There was no space that was not God. And what God needed to do to create the physical world was he had to do a kind of tzimtzum, a contraction into himself, almost like creating a donut, where there's a space in the middle where the physical world could exist. And then he took the material world that was left and formed it into special vessels, bowls or tubes that could contain his divine light, and he emanated his divine power into that material world through those vessels. But because the vessels were material, they could not contain the incredible effervescence of divine power, and they shattered, and they became scattered throughout the real world, the material world. And so now, the task of the mystically minded Jew, and they have a very important task. Their task is to perform what the God has told them to do with the proper mystical intention as a way of liberating those divine sparks that are stuck to the pieces, the material pieces of those vessels. And if you can free those divine sparks to return to God, gradually restoring the Godhead to its primordial unity, you can in fact bring forward the time of redemption and salvation, the Messiah, the ultimate triumph of Godhood in the world. Now we're fortunate because God has given us all the rules and all the practices we need to do. That's the halakha. That's the religious practice. But we need that special mystical focus and intention on the Zohar, imagining myself as Yesod and my wife as the Shekhinah, or myself as Israel and my wife as the Shekhinah when we're having sex on Shabbat. I mean, this is actually one of the things they talk about as a kind of mystical union between Israel and Shabbat, or between Israel and the Godhead. And if we have the proper mystical intention as we're doing this, we can in fact repair the universe. And it's in mystical Jewish thought that you first see this phrase, Tikkun Olam. It didn't start as environmental cleanup. It started as this mystically inclined repairing of the world by saving the divine sparks from the shattered vessels, from the beginning of creation to the end of time. Okay, so hopefully you can see how the historical shattering experience of an expulsion from Spain and pogroms and crusades could lead to a kind of mystically inclined thought that says the world is shattered, but we have some agency to try to repair it. It's not by community service and social action. It's by mystical thought and practice. Now, I'm not saying it's illegitimate now to say Tikkun Olam and mean community service and environmental cleanups. I'm just saying this is where the source has its origin. Now, there's even an extreme case of getting caught up in this mystically inclined thought that takes place in the middle of the 1600s. There's a man named Shabbetai Zvi, and if you read the historical atlas of Jewish history, that's one of the recommended texts for the class, there's a wonderful sort of discussion of his story that gives you some of the detail. You can also read more about him. Rabbi Chalom has a whole book about him, but there's lots of other sources you can find. Shabbetai Zvi is born in Izmir, which is in the Ottoman Empire on the coast of the Mediterranean. But he's convinced that he's destined for great things. He was supposedly born on Tisha B'Av, the memory of the destruction of the temple, and one legend holds the Messiah would be born on Tisha B'Av, on the day of the destruction of the temple. He may have actually been a kind of manic depressive because of some of the things he said and did over his lifetime. He had a penchant for publicly and flagrantly breaking Jewish laws. But people tried to find a way to rationalize the fact that he was doing this. You know, maybe the Messiah comes to fulfill the laws by breaking them. You know, one of these sort of paradoxes. Remember, one of the tricks of sounding mystically astute is you say two opposite things and say they're both true. And then you sound like you have profound wisdom. So, for example, it is wide, but it is narrow. It is deep, but it is shallow. It is light, but it is dark. I have no deeper message than saying the opposite, but it sounds deep. So Shabbetai Zvi was one of these. He was someone who was breaking the laws, but his advertisers, his promoters, especially a man named Nathan of Gaza, found ways to rationalize this and found ways to claim him as indeed possibly the Messiah come to the world as a way of repairing the sparks. Remember those sparks shattered, buried? Well, maybe the way you have to save some of the deepest buried sparks is by transgressions with the proper intention, not just by, like, maybe we've saved all the ones we can save by following the rules. Now we got to make new rules and do it differently. I mean, there's even some passages in traditional literature you could deploy. At one point, they point out the highlight of the fact that the word for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement in the Bible, is actually Yom HaKippurim. It's plural. So literally, it was originally the Day of Atonements, plural. But people noticed the parallel to that and the rabbinic holiday of Purim, which is about joy and happiness. So they say in the day of the Messiah, Yom Kippur will become like Yom Kippurim. It will be a day like Purim. So maybe the Messiah's come, he can do it. You know, he can wear a mask and sing on Yom Kippur, and it's okay. So Shabbetai Zvi gets a lot of followers. His reputation spreads broadly. I mean, there are Jews in Eastern Europe, Jews in Amsterdam, who are like waiting on the tops of their houses for the angels to pick them up and bring them to the land of Israel for the Messianic redemption. Well, Shabbetai Zvi is living in the Ottoman Empire. the Ottoman Empire is ruled by a sultan who gets reports of this unrest coming from this person claiming to be the Messiah. And so Shabbetai goes to Istanbul. He's arrested by the Sultan in the year 1666, when of course people are wound up anyways because the Christians are going nuts over the year 1666 because of the sign of the devil and Book of Revelations and so on. And the Sultan gives Shabbetai a very simple choice. He says, okay, you're making trouble. I'll give you a choice. You can convert to Islam or I'll kill you. Now, Jews have had a Messiah get killed before. It worked out pretty well for the Christian movement, right? In this case, Shabbetai takes option B. He decides to convert to Islam. Now, that's a hard pill to swallow for most of his followers. For the Messiah to convert to another religion, that's a tough one. But as we know with cult behavior, the most diehards will find some way to make sense of it. And in fact, that's what they do. They follow him in converting to Islam, but maintaining a kind of crypto-Jewish identity, because they imagine he's going to liberate those deep sparks, the sparks hidden even in the depths of Islam. Now he will find a way to free them. And they become a community called the Donme, or the converts, that are based in Greece and in some other cities. Salonika was a major center for them at one time. I think you can still find a few of them out there, not a great number. But they are the descendants of the Sabbatian movement that followed Shabbetai all the way into Islam. But most of those who were believing in Shabbetai were disillusioned. They said, "Oh, we got had. This is oopsie." And in fact, it's around this time that the rabbis put in a rule about not studying Jewish mysticism until you're over a certain point. In fact, they decree the age of 40 as the age at which men are allowed to study the Zohar, and they have to be married, so they have to be grounded in some level, and over age 40 before they're even able to study the book. So it's restricting it to a certain audience. In fact, when I had a friend turn 40, I bought him a volume of the Zohar, just because it was a new translation coming out, just as an echo to that story. But you can't stop that mystical train once it's left the station. There's a ferment out there. And remember also what we learned last time about what happened in the mid-1600s, the massive pogroms of Khmelnytsky in Eastern Europe that devastated Jewish life in Ukraine and parts of Poland. They were ripe for a Shabbetai Zvi mystical redemption. And even there was a follower to Shabbetai Zvi named Jakob Frank, who also creates a kind of cult of personality in the early 1700s. Some were sucked up in that too. But in the end, what really sucks in the people of Eastern Europe is this new trend called Hasidism. And Hasidism begins with one teacher whose name is Israel Baal Shem Tov, also known as the Besht. Again, Baal Shem Tov, they just make an acronym out of the name. He's born in 1700 and dies in 1760. His burial is in a place called Mezibush, which is in Ukraine. It's now a pilgrimage site, by the way. Thousands of Hasidic Jews will make the pilgrimage to Mezibush to mark their time with the Besht on his yahrzeit, on his anniversary of his death. And honestly, it's a big market in prostitutes and drugs for that time period because they're away from home, and who knows, I mean, this is the irony about this trip to Ukraine. In any case, the Baal Shem Tov was known as a miracle worker. Baal Shem Tov literally means master of the good name. He could use the divine name to make amulets and cure people. But he was also known for his deep piety, his learning that seemed to come out of nowhere, and his example of a especially holy life. Now, when the Baal Shem Tov dies in 1760, one of his followers, who's known as the Maggid of Mezrich, the storyteller of the town of Mezrich, creates a circle of disciples based on the model of the Besht, the Baal Shem Tov, and he tells the stories of the Baal Shem Tov that ultimately get written down. And ultimately, it's from him that this group of followers go off into various towns and begin to start their own following of the model of Hasidic Judaism. So what I'm going to do now is, again, share an image with you that'll show you the map of the spread. This comes from the historical atlas again. And so you'll notice here's Mezibush, where Baal Shem Tov is buried, but you also have Mezrich, which is sort of the starting point for this Hasidic movement. And you'll notice these green lines extending out from here where these disciples of the Maggid of Mezrich spread out and ultimately set up their own shops to become their own Hasidic rabbis in these Hasidic centers. And you might notice some familiar names from different sects of Hasidic Judaism that exist even today. So you'll notice here to the right and south, you've got Bratslav. There's a whole Hasidic sect called the Bratslavers. Going around counterclockwise to the left, you've got Vizhnitsia. There's the Vizhnitz sect of Hasidism, going again further north, sort of straight west of Mezrich. You've got Belts. The Belzer Hasidim is a very large sect today. You have, if you go straight north, the town of Stolin, that was also a very important center. Believe it or not, Chernobyl, which we think of as a radioactive site, was a major center of Hasidic generations. Again, notice it's the second generation here. If you look in the far, like bottom left, just to the right of the code, you see this town called Satu Mare. You ever heard of the Satmar Hasidim that's based there? Actually, Satu Mare means Saint Mary in Hungarian. Don't tell the Satmars, they don't believe in that etymology, but that's what it is. And that was part of the second generation. And then far up in the northeast here, you'll notice a little tiny town called Lubavitch, which is where the first Lubavitcher Rebbe is based. That's the foundation of Chabad, or Chabad Lubavitch, that we see, accosting people and asking them to put on tefillin and shake a lulav and etrog all over the Jewish world. So the basic premise of Hasidism and what made it so popular were sort of three levels. The first was you had a charismatic leader. That is known as the Rebbe. Not the rabbi, but the Rebbe, with this Yiddish inflection, has a different resonance to it. The Rebbe is also sometimes called the tzaddik, the righteous one. And the premise is that the Rebbe is perfect. He is the best example you will ever have of how to live a Jewish life. A famous story attributed to the Hasidic world is that one man says, I'm going to go to the Rebbe's tish, the Rebbe's table, to learn great Torah from him about this Torah portion of the week. And another man says, I'm going to go to the Rebbe's table and watch him tie his shoes, and I'll learn a great lesson from that. The concept is that the miracle work of the holy man is a model in whatever he does. And so if you were a Hasid, if you were one of these lovers, you weren't just a freelance Hasid who followed anybody. You were a Hasid of Belts. You were a Hasid of Bratzav, a Hasid of, you had a Rebbe, you had a community that defined what you did and how you did it. And in particular, you connected to the Rebbe. See, the model was the Rebbe could talk to God and could connect directly. You couldn't necessarily do that. God's pretty big. God's pretty strong. But you can connect, glue yourself to the Rebbe. In fact, the word for cleaving was dvekut, dvekus, and it's from the word devek, glue. Like you stick yourself to the Rebbe and he'll pull you along. So if you ever watch any movies that depict the Hasidic world, and one example that I like because it has a kind of humanistic message to it is called The Price Above Rubies. There's one scene in there where they're driving their car in town in Brooklyn, and all of a sudden the Rebbe is getting out of a store. And the man of the family parks the car in the middle of the street, gets out of the store, and goes to crowd around the Rebbe as he's walking from the store into his car. And then he comes back in his car and he's all smiling. I saw the Rebbe. I saw the Rebbe. Like it's like seeing God. It's this representative on earth. It's the intermediary that you connect to because that's as close as you're going to get to God. So you have the tzaddik and the chassid. There's sort of a two-sided coin. And some of the tzaddikim were corrupt and abused their power, and some were genuinely good people. There's a famous story of one of these tzaddikim who, every time he went out in the winter, he would give his coat away to a poor man. And they would say to him, why do you keep giving away your coats to this poor guy? And his response was, well, my followers will always make sure I get a coat. They wouldn't necessarily give it to the poor guy. So I'm going to give my coat to the poor guy. They'll get me another coat. So that's, again, using your power for good. But it took all types, and there were rivalries. I mean, even right now, there's a major split in the Satmar community between the Zalmanis and the Aroinis, because there were two sons of the previous Satmar Rebbe. One was named Zalman and one is named Aaron, and they both claimed the mantle of his authority after he died. And there's a split in the community between some who follow one and some who follow the other. And they both claim the Satmar tradition, but it's a sibling rivalry and an heir rivalry, and that's what you get in all kinds of human settings. The most important part of Hasidism, though, and this is what really set it apart from the establishment of the day, is this concept of the emotion, the internal intention. There's a word in Hebrew for strict practice of reciting prayers and following halakha, following Jewish law. It's called keva. Keva is the fixed form. And the internal side, the intention, is called kavanah. It's how you're feeling, what your direction or intention is as you're reciting the prayers or doing the ritual practice. You can hear echoes of that mysticism in there, right? That you have to have the right mystical kavanah to fully accomplish the Tikkun Olam. Well, what the Hasids did in their first couple generations that was so scandalous was they said, kavanah is more important than keva. Remember the guy reciting the Aleph Bet? That's kavanah. That was seen as even more important than keva. Famous story of the Baal Shem Tov. He assigned one of his followers to blow the shofar at Yom Kippur, at the end of the Day of Atonement, and gave him certain intentions, certain kavanot that he had to follow to do so. But when it came time for that end of the holiday, he knew how to blow the shofar, but he could not remember the correct intentions. And he was just totally devastated to have failed the community and failed the Baal Shem Tov in such a way. And afterwards, the Baal Shem Tov came to the man, and the man confessed that he had failed. And the Baal Shem Tov said, the king's house has many doors, and each door has a unique key. But the universal key to open all the doors is the broken heart. In other words, your grief and your pain at having messed up, which is part of the theme of the holiday of I've sinned and forgive me, that was enough. That opened all the doors, even if you didn't have the specific thoughts in mind. So that focus on kavanah over keva, on one hand, is very inclusive, right? You don't have to even know the words for the prayers. You don't have to read. It was wonderfully popular among the working classes. It was terribly unpopular among the educated classes, who had spent all that time learning how to read and recite the exact words. What are you doing saying that's not important? All that time spent studying Talmud, you're saying I didn't need to do that? So there wound up being a split in the Jewish world in Eastern Europe between the Hasidim, those sort of pious followers and their rabbis, and the established community, what are known as the Mitnagdim, or the Mitnagdim in Yiddish, which means the opponents. And you can tell who won by who gets called the opponents, right? The popular movement of Hasidism was the dominant trend. And the opponents were fighting a rearguard action, so much so they got named the opponents. Today they call themselves Yeshivish or Litvish, like Lithuanian, but they were the opponents. And you'll notice there's a series of blue squares up here and blue lines that mark the yeshivas, the rabbinical schools of these opponents that try to impose strict keva, strict fixed form, strict ritual practice, and strict prayer practice. They would make fun of the Rebbes going off in the woods to do cartwheels and all kinds of other crazy things to get in the right intention, reciting the prayers not exactly at the specific time, but when they felt moved to. There was a real rivalry between the two, so much so that you notice that town of Lubavitch is in the north, and the sort of orbit of influence of Lithuania here, and all these Mitnagdim yeshivas. One of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe's was reported to the Russian police by the establishment as having done an innovation in religion, and therefore that was prohibited by the czars. Well, so this is really dangerous. Each side excommunicated the other. It became a real rivalry for, again, the mid to late 1700s into the early 1800s. One of the most famous figures in Vilna, part of this opposition group, is a man named Elijah, the Gaon, the genius of Vilna, who was well known for his Talmudic erudition and literacy. He also made contributions to mathematics, by the way. If you look him up as Elijah of Vilna, you'll see some of his contributions to the general study of mathematics. But he led the opposition, fighting back against this Hasidic sweep. In the end, the Hasidic and the Mitnagdim worlds are almost impossible to tell apart today. The outsiders have real trouble telling the Yeshivish people from the Hasidic people. Maybe the Hasidic people dance more or are more uplifting. You think of Fiddler on the Roof and picking people up with chairs at weddings. That's Hasidic. But by and large, you can't tell the difference. And the reason why you can't tell the difference is that they came up with a common enemy. By the beginning of the 19th century, early 1800s into the mid 1800s, there was a new Jewish group in town that was threatening to both of them. And this was the group called the Maskilim, the Enlighteners, who wanted to modernize Jewish life, to change Jewish dress, to learn non-Jewish languages, to be influenced by non-Jewish ideas and philosophy. And when push came to shove, the Mitnagdim, the opponents, and the Hasidim, the pietists, came to a truce. The truce was, okay, Hasidim, let's channel your enthusiasm within the bounds of halachic practice and focus that enthusiasm on studying Talmud and Torah, and we'll forgive your excesses and jumping around and dancing stuff and your cleaving to the Rebbe stuff, but let's follow sort of a common core of what today we would call ultra-Orthodox practice that specifically rejects modernity. So this is also why the Hasidic world marks the beginning of modernity, because it marks the rejection of the Enlighteners, the Haskalah, which we'll talk about next time, by the ultra-Orthodox, which today encompasses both the opponents and the Hasidim. At one time they fought each other, and then they made common cause against a more dangerous enemy they felt, which was the Enlighteners. So we'll have to hear about them the next time.